57. The development of material knowledge. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries and the opening years of the 19th century, while these conflicts of the powers and princes were going on in Europe, and the patchwork of the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, was changing kaleidoscopically into the patchwork of the Treaty of Vienna, 1815, and while the sailing ship was spreading European influence throughout the world, a steady growth of knowledge and a general clearing up of men's ideas about the world in which they lived was in progress in the European and Europeanized world. It went on disconnected from political life, and producing throughout the 17th and 18th centuries no striking immediate results in political life. Nor was it affecting popular thought very profoundly during this period. These reactions were to come later, and only in their full force in the latter half of the 19th century. It was a process that went on chiefly in a small world of prosperous and independent-spirited people. Without what the English call the private gentleman, the scientific process could not have begun in Greece, and could not have been renewed in Europe. The universities played a part but not a leading part in the philosophical and scientific thought of this period. Endowed learning is apt to be timid and conservative learning, lacking in initiative and resistant to innovation, unless it has the spur of contact with independent minds. We have already noted the formation of the Royal Society in 1662 and its work in realizing the dream of Bacon's New Atlantis. Throughout the 18th century there was much clearing up of general ideas about matter and motion, much mathematical advance, a systematic development of the use of optical glass in microscope and telescope, a renewed energy in classificatory natural history, a great revival of anatomical science. The science of geology, foreshadowed by Aristotle and anticipated by Leonardo da Vinci, 1452–1519, began its great task of interpreting the record of the rocks. The progress of physical science reacted upon metallurgy. Improved metallurgy, affording the possibility of a larger and bolder handling of masses of metal and other materials, reacted upon practical inventions. Machinery on a new scale and in a new abundance appeared to revolutionize industry. In 1804 Trevithick adapted the Watt engine to transport and made the first locomotive. In 1825 the first railway, between Stockton and Darlington, was opened, and Stephenson's rocket, with a 13-ton train, got up to a speed of 44 miles per hour. From 1830 onward railways multiplied. By the middle of the century a network of railways had spread all over Europe. Here was a sudden change in what had long been a fixed condition of human life, the maximum rate of land transport. After the Russian disaster, Napoleon traveled from near Vilna to Paris in 312 hours. This was a journey of about 1,400 miles. He was traveling with every conceivable advantage, and he averaged under 5 miles an hour. An ordinary traveler could not have done this distance in twice the time. These were about the same maximum rates of travel as held good between Rome and Gaul in the 1st century AD. Then suddenly came this tremendous change. The railways reduced this journey for any ordinary traveler to less than 48 hours. That is to say, they reduced the chief European distances to about a tenth of what they had been. They made it possible to carry out administrative work in areas 10 times as great as any that had hitherto been workable under one administration. The full significance of that possibility in Europe still remains to be realized. Europe is still netted in boundaries drawn in the horse and road era. In America the effects were immediate. To the United States of America, sprawling westward, it meant the possibility of a continuous access to Washington, however far the frontier traveled across the continent. It meant unity, sustained on a scale that would otherwise have been impossible. The steamboat was, if anything, a little ahead of the steam engine in its earlier phases. There was a steamboat, the Charlotte Dundas. On the Firth of Clyde Canal in 1802, and in 1807 an American named Fulton had a steamer, the Claremont, with British-built engines, upon the Hudson River above New York. The first steamship to put to sea was also an American, the Phoenix, which went from New York, Hoboken, to Philadelphia. So, too, was the first ship using steam. She also had sails to cross the Atlantic, the Savannah, 1819. All these were paddle wheel boats, and paddle wheel boats are not adapted to work in heavy seas. The paddles smash too easily, and the boat is then disabled. The screw steamship followed rather slowly. Many difficulties had to be surmounted before the screw was a practicable thing. Not until the middle of the century did the tonnage of steamships upon the sea begin to overhaul that of sailing ships. After that, the evolution in sea transport was rapid. For the first time, men began to cross the seas and oceans with some certainty as to the date of their arrival. The transatlantic crossing, which had been an uncertain adventure of several weeks, which might stretch to months, was accelerated, until in 1910 it was brought down, in the case of the fastest boats, to under 5 days, with a practically notifiable hour of arrival. Concurrently with the development of steam transport upon land and sea, a new and striking addition to the facilities of human intercourse arose out of the investigations of Volta, Galvani, and Faraday into various electrical phenomena. The electric telegraph came into existence in 1835. The first undersea cable was laid in 1851 between France and England. In a few years the telegraph system had spread over the civilized world, and news which had hitherto traveled slowly from point to point became practically simultaneous throughout the earth. These things, the steam railway and the electric telegraph, were to the popular imagination of the middle 19th century the most striking and revolutionary of inventions, but they were only the most conspicuous and clumsy first fruits of a far more extensive process. Technical knowledge and skill were developing with an extraordinary rapidity, and to an extraordinary extent measured by the progress of any previous age. Far less conspicuous at first in everyday life, but finally far more important, was the extension of man's power over various structural materials. Before the middle of the 18th century, iron was reduced from its ores by means of wood charcoal, was handled in small pieces, and hammered and wrought into shape. It was material for a craftsman. Quality and treatment were enormously dependent upon the experience and sagacity of the individual ironworker. The largest masses of iron that could be dealt with under those conditions amounted at most, in the 16th century, to 2 or 3 tons. There was a very definite upward limit, therefore, to the size of cannon. The blast furnace rose in the 18th century and developed with the use of coke. Not before the 18th century do we find rolled sheet iron, 1728, and rolled rods and bars, 1783. Nasmyth's steam hammer came as late as 1838. The ancient world, because of its metallurgical inferiority, could not use steam. The steam engine, even the primitive pumping engine, could not develop before sheet iron was available. The early engines seemed to the modern eye very pitiful and clumsy bits of ironmongery, but they were the utmost that the metallurgical science of the time could do. As late as 1856 came the Bessemer process, and presently, 1864, the open hearth process, in which steel and every sort of iron could be melted, purified, and cast in a manner and upon a scale hitherto unheard of. Today in the electric furnace one may see tons of incandescent steel swirling about like boiling milk in a saucepan. Nothing in the previous practical advances of mankind is comparable in its consequences to the complete mastery over enormous masses of steel and iron and over their texture and quality which man has now achieved. The railways and early engines of all sorts were the mere first triumphs of the new metallurgical methods. Presently came ships of iron and steel, vast bridges, and a new way of building with steel upon a gigantic scale. Men realized too late that they had planned their railways with far too timid a gauge, that they could have organized their traveling with far more steadiness and comfort upon a much bigger scale. Before the 19th century there were no ships in the world much over 2,000 tons burthen. Now there is nothing wonderful about a 50,000-ton liner. There are people who sneer at this kind of progress as being a progress in mere size, but that sort of sneering merely marks the intellectual limitations of those who indulge in it. The great ship or the steel frame building is not, as they imagine, a magnified version of the small ship or building of the past. It is a thing different in kind, more lightly and strongly built, of finer and stronger materials. Instead of being a thing of precedent and rule of thumb, it is a thing of subtle and intricate calculation. In the old house or ship, matter was dominant, the material and its needs had to be slavishly obeyed. In the new, matter had been captured, changed, coerced. Think of the coal and iron and sand dragged out of the banks and pits, wrenched, wrought, molten and cast, to be flung at last, a slender glittering pinnacle of steel and glass, 600 feet above the crowded city. We have given these particulars of the advance in man's knowledge of the metallurgy of steel and its results by way of illustration. A parallel story could be told of the metallurgy of copper and tin, and of a multitude of metals, nickel and aluminium to name but two, unknown before the 19th century dawned. It is in this great and growing mastery over substances, over different sorts of glass, over rocks and plasters and the like, over colors and textures, that the main triumphs of the mechanical revolution have thus far been achieved. Yet we are still in the stage of the first fruits in the matter. We have the power, but we have still to learn how to use our power. Many of the first employments of these gifts of science have been vulgar, tawdry, stupid or horrible. The artist and the adapter have still hardly begun to work with the endless variety of substances now at their disposal. Parallel with this extension of mechanical possibilities, the new science of electricity grew up. It was only in the 80s of the 19th century that this body of inquiry began to yield results to impress the vulgar mind. Then suddenly came electric light and electric traction, and the transmutation of forces, the possibility of sending power, that could be changed into mechanical motion or light or heat as one chose, along a copper wire, as water is sent along a pipe, began to come through to the ideas of ordinary people. The British and French were at first the leading peoples in this great proliferation of knowledge, but presently the Germans, who had learnt humility under Napoleon, showed such zeal and pertinacity in scientific inquiry as to overhaul these leaders. British science was largely the creation of Englishmen and Scotchmen working outside the ordinary centres of erudition. The universities of Britain were at this time in a state of educational retrogression, largely given over to a pedantic conning of the Latin and Greek classics. French education, too, was dominated by the classical tradition of the Jesuit schools, and consequently it was not difficult for the Germans to organize a body of investigators, small indeed in relation to the possibilities of the case, but large in proportion to the little band of British and French inventors and experimentalists. And though this work of research and experiment was making Britain and France the most rich and powerful countries in the world, it was not making scientific and inventive men rich and powerful. There is a necessary unworldliness about a sincere scientific man. He is too preoccupied with his research to plan and scheme how to make money out of it. The economic exploitation of his discoveries falls very easily and naturally, therefore, into the hands of a more acquisitive type, and so we find that the crops of rich men which every fresh phase of scientific and technical progress has produced in Great Britain, though they have not displayed quite the same passionate desire to insult and kill the goose that laid the national golden eggs as the scholastic and clerical professions, have been quite content to let that profitable creature starve. Inventors and discoverers came by nature, they thought, for clever people to profit by. In this matter the Germans were a little wiser. The German learned did not display the same vehement hatred of the new learning. They permitted its development. The German businessman and manufacturer again had not quite the same contempt for the man of science as had his British competitor. Knowledge, these Germans believed, might be a cultivated crop, responsive to fertilizers. They did concede, therefore, a certain amount of opportunity to the scientific mind. Their public expenditure on scientific work was relatively greater, and this expenditure was abundantly rewarded. By the latter half of the 19th century the German scientific worker had made German a necessary language for every science student who wished to keep abreast with the latest work in his department, and in certain branches, and particularly in chemistry, Germany acquired a very great superiority over her Western neighbors. The scientific effort of the 60s and 70s in Germany began to tell after the 80s, and the German gained steadily upon Britain and France in technical and industrial prosperity. A fresh phase in the history of invention opened when in the 80s a new type of engine came into use, an engine in which the expansive force of an explosive mixture replaced the expansive force of steam. The light, highly efficient engines that were thus made possible were applied to the automobile, and developed at last to reach such a pitch of lightness and efficiency as to render flight, long known to be possible, a practical achievement. A successful flying machine, but not a machine large enough to take up a human body, was made by Professor Langley of the Smithsonian Institute of Washington as early as 1897. By 1909 the aeroplane was available for human locomotion. There had seemed to be a pause in the increase of human speed with the perfection of railways and automobile road traction, but with the flying machine came fresh reductions in the effective distance between one point of the Earth's surface and another. In the 18th century the distance from London to Edinburgh was an 8 days' journey. In 1918 the British Civil Air Transport Commission reported that the journey from London to Melbourne, halfway round the Earth, would probably in a few years' time be accomplished in that same period of 8 days. Too much stress must not be laid upon these striking reductions in the time distances of one place from another. They are merely one aspect of a much profounder and more momentous enlargement of human possibility. The science of agriculture and agricultural chemistry, for instance, made quite parallel advances during the 19th century. Men learnt so to fertilize the soil as to produce quadruple and quintuple the crops got from the same area in the 17th century. There was a still more extraordinary advance in medical science. The average duration of life rose, the daily efficiency increased, the waste of life through ill health diminished. Now here altogether we have such a change in human life as to constitute a fresh phase of history. In a little more than a century this mechanical revolution has been brought about. In that time man made a stride in the material conditions of his life vaster than he had done during the whole long interval between the Paleolithic stage and the age of cultivation, or between the days of Pepi in Egypt and those of George III. A new gigantic material framework for human affairs has come into existence. Clearly it demands great readjustments of our social, economical, and political methods. But these readjustments have necessarily waited upon the development of the mechanical revolution, and they are still only in their opening stage today. 58. The Industrial Revolution. There is a tendency in many histories to confuse together what we have here called the mechanical revolution, which was an entirely new thing in human experience arising out of the development of organized science, a new step like the invention of agriculture or the discovery of metals, with something else, quite different in its origins, something for which there was already an historical precedent, the social and financial development which is called the Industrial Revolution. The two processes were going on together, they were constantly reacting upon each other, but they were in root and essence different. There would have been an industrial revolution of sorts if there had been no coal, no steam, no machinery, but in that case it would probably have followed far more closely upon the lines of the social and financial developments of the later years of the Roman Republic. It would have repeated the story of dispossessed free cultivators, gang labor, great estates, great financial fortunes, and a socially destructive financial process. Even the factory method came before power and machinery. Factories were the product not of machinery, but of the division of labor. Drilled and sweated workers were making such things as millinery cardboard boxes and furniture, and coloring maps and book illustrations and so forth, before even water wheels had been used for industrial purposes. There were factories in Rome in the days of Augustus. New books, for instance, were dictated to rows of copyists in the factories of the booksellers. The attentive student of Defoe and of the political pamphlets of Fielding will realize that the idea of herding poor people into establishments to work collectively for their living was already current in Britain before the close of the 17th century. There are intimations of it even as early as More's Utopia, 1516. It was a social and not a mechanical development. Up to past the middle of the 18th century the social and economic history of Western Europe was in fact retreading the path along which the Roman state had gone in the last 3 centuries BC. But the political disunions of Europe, the political convulsions against monarchy, the recalcitrance of the common folk, and perhaps also the greater accessibility of the Western European intelligence to mechanical ideas and inventions, turned the process into quite novel directions. Ideas of human solidarity, thanks to Christianity, were far more widely diffused in the newer European world. Political power was not so concentrated, and the man of energy anxious to get rich turned his mind, therefore, very willingly from the ideas of the slave and of gang labor to the idea of mechanical power and the machine. The mechanical revolution, the process of mechanical invention and discovery, was a new thing in human experience, and it went on regardless of the social, political, economic and industrial consequences it might produce. The Industrial Revolution, on the other hand, like most other human affairs, was and is more and more profoundly changed and deflected by the constant variation in human conditions caused by the mechanical revolution. And the essential difference between the amassing of riches, the extinction of small farmers and small businessmen, and the phase of big finance in the latter centuries of the Roman Republic on the one hand, and the very similar concentration of capital in the 18th and 19th centuries on the other, lies in the profound difference in the character of labor that the mechanical revolution was bringing about. The power of the old world was human power. Everything depended ultimately upon the driving power of human muscle, the muscle of ignorant and subjugated men. A little animal muscle, supplied by draft oxen, horse traction, and the like, contributed. Where a weight had to be lifted, men lifted it. Where a rock had to be quarried, men chipped it out. Where a field had to be plowed, men and oxen plowed it. The Roman equivalent of the steamship was the galley with its bank of sweating rowers. A vast proportion of mankind in the early civilizations were employed in purely mechanical drudgery. At its onset, power-driven machinery did not seem to promise any release from such unintelligent toil. Great gangs of men were employed in excavating canals, in making railway cuttings and embankments, and the like. The number of miners increased enormously. But the extension of facilities and the output of commodities increased much more. And as the 19th century went on, the plain logic of the new situation asserted itself more clearly. Human beings were no longer wanted as a source of mere indiscriminate power. What could be done mechanically by a human being could be done faster and better by a machine. The human being was needed now only where choice and intelligence had to be exercised. Human beings were wanted only as human beings. The drudge, on whom all the previous civilizations had rested, the creature of mere obedience, the man whose brains were superfluous, had become unnecessary to the welfare of mankind. This was as true of such ancient industries as agriculture and mining as it was of the newest metallurgical processes. For plowing, sowing and harvesting, swift machines came forward to do the work of scores of men. The Roman civilization was built upon cheap and degraded human beings. Modern civilization is being rebuilt upon cheap mechanical power. For 100 years power has been getting cheaper and labor dearer. If for a generation or so machinery has had to wait its turn in the mine, it is simply because for a time men were cheaper than machinery. Now here was a changeover of quite primary importance in human affairs. The chief solicitude of the rich and of the ruler in the old civilization had been to keep up a supply of drudges. As the 19th century went on, it became more and more plain to the intelligent directive people that the common man had now to be something better than a drudge. He had to be educated, if only to secure industrial efficiency. He had to understand what he was about. From the days of the first Christian propaganda, popular education had been smoldering in Europe, just as it had smoldered in Asia wherever Islam has set its foot, because of the necessity of making the believer understand a little of the belief by which he is saved, and of enabling him to read a little in the sacred books by which his belief is conveyed. Christian controversies, with their competition for adherents, ploughed the ground for the harvest of popular education. In England, for instance, by the 30s and 40s of the 19th century, the disputes of the sects and the necessity of catching adherents young had produced a series of competing educational organizations for children, the Church National Schools, the dissenting British schools, and even Roman Catholic elementary schools. The second half of the 19th century was a period of rapid advance in popular education throughout all the westernized world. There was no parallel advance in the education of the upper classes, some advance, no doubt, but nothing to correspond, and so the great gulf that had divided that world hitherto into the readers and the non-reading mass became little more than a slightly perceptible difference in educational level. At the back of this process was the mechanical revolution, apparently regardless of social conditions, but really insisting inexorably upon the complete abolition of a totally illiterate class throughout the world. The economic revolution of the Roman Republic had never been clearly apprehended by the common people of Rome. The ordinary Roman citizen never saw the changes through which he lived, clearly and comprehensively as we see them. But the Industrial Revolution, as it went on towards the end of the 19th century, was more and more distinctly seen as one whole process by the common people it was affecting, because presently they could read and discuss and communicate, and because they went about and saw things as no commonalty had ever done before. 59. The development of modern political and social ideas. The institutions and customs and political ideas of the ancient civilizations grew up slowly, age by age, no man designing and no man foreseeing. It was only in that great century of human adolescence, the 6th century BC, that men began to think clearly about their relations to one another, and first to question and first propose to alter and rearrange the established beliefs and laws and methods of human government. We have told of the glorious intellectual dawn of Greece and Alexandria, and how presently the collapse of the slave-holding civilizations and the clouds of religious intolerance and absolutist government darkened the promise of that beginning. The light of fearless thinking did not break through the European obscurity again effectually until the 15th and 16th centuries. We have tried to show something of the share of the great winds of Arab curiosity and Mongol conquest in this gradual clearing of the mental skies of Europe. And at first it was chiefly material knowledge that increased. The first fruits of the recovered manhood of the race were material achievements and material power. The science of human relationship, of individual and social psychology, of education, and of economics, are not only more subtle and intricate in themselves but also bound up inextricably with much emotional matter. The advances made in them have been slower and made against greater opposition. Men will listen dispassionately to the most diverse suggestions about stars or molecules, but ideas about our ways of life touch and reflect upon everyone about us. And just as in Greece the bold speculations of Plato came before Aristotle's hard search for fact, so in Europe the first political inquiries of the new phase were put in the form of utopian stories, directly imitated from Plato's Republic and his laws. Sir Thomas More's Utopia is a curious imitation of Plato that bore fruit in a New English poor law. The Neapolitan Campanella's City of the Sun was more fantastic and less fruitful. By the end of the 17th century we find a considerable and growing literature of political and social science was being produced. Among the pioneers in this discussion was John Locke, the son of an English Republican, an Oxford scholar who first directed his attention to chemistry and medicine. His treatises on government, toleration, and education show a mind fully awake to the possibilities of social reconstruction. Parallel with and a little later than John Locke in England, Montesquieu, 1689 to 1755, in France subjected social, political, and religious institutions to a searching and fundamental analysis. He stripped the magical prestige from the absolutist monarchy in France. He shares with Locke the credit for clearing away many of the false ideas that had hitherto prevented deliberate and conscious attempts to reconstruct human society. The generation that followed him in the middle and later decades of the 18th century was boldly speculative upon the moral and intellectual clearings he had made. A group of brilliant writers, the encyclopedists, mostly rebel spirits from the excellent schools of the Jesuits, set themselves to scheme out a new world, 1766. Side by side with the encyclopedists were the economists or physiocrats, who were making bold and crude inquiries into the production and distribution of food and goods. Morelli, the author of the Code de la Nature, denounced the institution of private property and proposed a communistic organization of society. He was the precursor of that large and various school of collectivist thinkers in the 19th century who are lumped together as socialists. What is socialism? There are 100 definitions of socialism and 1,000 sects of socialists. Essentially, socialism is no more and no less than a criticism of the idea of property in the light of the public good. We may review the history of that idea through the ages very briefly. That and the idea of internationalism are the two cardinal ideas upon which most of our political life is turning. The idea of property arises out of the combative instincts of the species. Long before men were men, the ancestral ape was a proprietor. Primitive property is what a beast will fight for. The dog and his bone, the tigress and her lair, the roaring stag and his herd, these are proprietorship blazing. No more nonsensical expression is conceivable in sociology than the term primitive communism. The old man of the family tribe of early Paleolithic times insisted upon his proprietorship in his wives and daughters, in his tools, in his visible universe. If any other man wandered into his visible universe, he fought him, and if he could, he slew him. The tribe grew in the course of ages, as Atkinson showed convincingly in his Primal Law. By the gradual toleration by the old man of the existence of the younger men, and of their proprietorship in the wives they captured from outside the tribe, and in the tools and ornaments they made and the game they slew. Human society grew by a compromise between this one's property and that. It was a compromise with instinct which was forced upon men by the necessity of driving some other tribe out of its visible universe. If the hills and forests and streams were not your land or my land, it was because they had to be our land. Each of us would have preferred to have it my land, but that would not work. In that case, the other fellows would have destroyed us. Society, therefore, is from its beginning a mitigation of ownership. Ownership in the beast and in the primitive savage was far more intense a thing than it is in the civilized world today. It is rooted more strongly in our instincts than in our reason. In the natural savage and in the untutored man today there is no limitation to the sphere of ownership. Whatever you can fight for, you can own: womenfolk, spared captive, captured beast, forest glade, stone pit, or what not. As the community grew, a sort of law came to restrain internecine fighting. Men developed rough and ready methods of settling proprietorship. Men could own what they were the first to make or capture or claim. It seemed natural that a debtor who could not pay should become the property of his creditor. Equally natural was it that after claiming a patch of land a man should exact payments from anyone who wanted to use it. It was only slowly, as the possibilities of organized life dawned on men, that this unlimited property in anything whatever began to be recognized as a nuisance. Men found themselves born into a universe all owned and claimed, nay, they found themselves born owned and claimed. The social struggles of the earlier civilization are difficult to trace now, but the history we have told of the Roman Republic shows a community waking up to the idea that debts may become a public inconvenience and should then be repudiated, and that the unlimited ownership of land is also an inconvenience. We find that later Babylonia severely limited the rights of property in slaves. Finally, we find in the teaching of that great revolutionist, Jesus of Nazareth, such an attack upon property as had never been before. Easier it was, he said, for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for the owner of great possessions to enter the kingdom of heaven. A steady, continuous criticism of the permissible scope of property seems to have been going on in the world for the last 25 or 30 centuries. 1900 years after Jesus of Nazareth, we find all the world that has come under the Christian teaching persuaded that there could be no property in human beings. And also the idea that a man may do what he likes with his own was very much shaken in relation to other sorts of property. But this world of the closing 18th century was still only in the interrogative stage in this matter. It had got nothing clear enough, much less settled enough, to act upon. One of its primary impulses was to protect property against the greed and waste of kings and the exploitation of noble adventurers. It was largely to protect private property from taxation that the French Revolution began. But the equalitarian formulae of the revolution carried it into a criticism of the very property it had risen to protect. How can men be free and equal when numbers of them have no ground to stand upon and nothing to eat, and the owners will neither feed nor lodge them unless they toil? Excessively, the poor complained. To which riddle the reply of one important political group was to set about dividing up. They wanted to intensify and universalize property. Aiming at the same end by another route, there were the primitive socialists, or, to be more exact, communists, who wanted to abolish private property altogether. The state, a democratic state was of course understood, was to own all property. It is paradoxical that different men seeking the same ends of liberty and happiness should propose on the one hand to make property as absolute as possible, and on the other to put an end to it altogether. But so it was. And the clue to this paradox is to be found in the fact that ownership is not one thing but a multitude of different things. It was only as the 19th century developed that men began to realize that property was not one simple thing, but a great complex of ownerships of different values and consequences, that many things, such as one's body, the implements of an artist, clothing, toothbrushes, are very profoundly and incurably one's personal property, and that there is a very great range of things, railways, machinery of various sorts, homes, cultivated gardens, pleasure boats, for example, which need each to be considered very particularly to determine how far and under what limitations it may come under private ownership, and how far it falls into the public domain and may be administered and let out by the state in the collective interest. On the practical side, these questions pass into politics, and the problem of making and sustaining efficient state administration. They open up issues in social psychology, and interact with the inquiries of educational science. The criticism of property is still a vast and passionate ferment rather than a science. On the one hand are the individualists, who would protect and enlarge our present freedoms with what we possess, and on the other the socialists who would in many directions pull our ownerships and restrain our proprietary acts. In practice one will find every gradation between the extreme individualist, who will scarcely tolerate attacks of any sort to support a government, and the communist who would deny any possessions at all. The ordinary socialist of today is what is called a collectivist. He would allow a considerable amount of private property but put such affairs as education, transport, mines, landowning, most mass productions of staple articles, and the like, into the hands of a highly organized state. Nowadays there does seem to be a gradual convergence of reasonable men towards a moderate socialism scientifically studied and planned. It is realized more and more clearly that the untutored man does not cooperate easily and successfully in large undertakings, and that every step towards a more complex state and every function that the state takes over from private enterprise, necessitates a corresponding educational advance and the organization of a proper criticism and control. Both the press and the political methods of the contemporary state are far too crude for any large extension of collective activities. But for a time the stresses between employer and employed, and particularly between selfish employers and reluctant workers, led to a worldwide dissemination of the very harsh and elementary form of communism which is associated with the name of Marx. Marx based his theories on a belief that men's minds are limited by their economic necessities, and that there is a necessary conflict of interests in our present civilization between the prosperous and employing classes of people and the employed mass. With the advance in education necessitated by the mechanical revolution, this great employed majority will become more and more class-conscious and more solid in antagonism to the class-conscious, ruling minority. In some way the class-conscious workers would seize power, he prophesied, and inaugurate a new social state. The antagonism, the insurrection, the possible revolution are understandable enough, but it does not follow that a new social state or anything but a socially destructive process will ensue. Put to the test in Russia, Marxism, as we shall note later, has proved singularly uncreative. Marx sought to replace national antagonism by class antagonisms. Marxism has produced in succession a first, a second, and a third workers' international. But from the starting point of modern individualistic thought, it is also possible to reach international ideas. From the days of that great English economist, Adam Smith, onward there has been an increasing realization that for worldwide prosperity free and unencumbered trade about the earth is needed. The individualist with his hostility to the state is hostile also to tariffs and boundaries and all the restraints upon free act and movement that national boundaries seem to justify. It is interesting to see two lines of thought, so diverse in spirit, so different in substance as this class war socialism of the Marxists and the individualistic free-trading philosophy of the British businessmen of the Victorian age heading at last, in spite of these primary differences, towards the same intimations of a new worldwide treatment of human affairs outside the boundaries and limitations of any existing state. The logic of reality triumphs over the logic of theory. We begin to perceive that from widely divergent starting points individualist theory and socialist theory are part of a common search, a search for more spacious social and political ideas and interpretations, upon which men may contrive to work together, a search that began again in Europe and has intensified as men's confidence in the ideas of the Holy Roman Empire and in Christendom decayed, and as the age of discovery broadened their horizons from the world of the Mediterranean to the whole wide world. To bring this description of the elaboration and development of social, economic, and political ideas right down to the discussions of the present day, would be to introduce issues altogether too controversial for the scope and intentions of this book. But regarding these things, as we do here, from the vast perspectives of the student of world history, we are bound to recognize that this reconstruction of these directive ideas in the human mind is still an unfinished task. We cannot even estimate yet how unfinished the task may be. Certain common beliefs do seem to be emerging, and their influence is very perceptible upon the political events and public acts of today, but at present they are not clear enough nor convincing enough to compel men definitely and systematically towards their realization. Men's acts waver between tradition and the new, and on the whole they rather gravitate towards the traditional. Yet, compared with the thought of even a brief lifetime ago, there does seem to be an outline shaping itself of a new order in human affairs. It is a sketchy outline, vanishing into vagueness at this point and that, and fluctuating in detail and formulae, yet it grows steadfastly clearer, and its main lines change less and less. It is becoming plainer and plainer each year that in many respects and in an increasing range of affairs, mankind is becoming one community, and that it is more and more necessary that in such matters there should be a common worldwide control. For example, it is steadily true that the whole planet is now one economic community, that the proper exploitation of its natural resources demands one comprehensive direction, and that the greater power and range that discovery has given human effort makes the present fragmentary and contentious administration of such affairs more and more wasteful and dangerous. Financial and monetary expedients also become worldwide interests to be dealt with successfully only on worldwide lines. Infectious diseases and the increase and migrations of population are also now plainly seen to be worldwide concerns. The greater power and range of human activities has also made war disproportionately destructive and disorganizing, and, even as a clumsy way of settling issues between government and people, ineffective. All these things clamor for controls and authorities of a greater range and greater comprehensiveness than any government that has hitherto existed. But it does not follow that the solution of these problems lies in some supergovernment of all the world arising by conquest or by the coalescence of existing governments. By analogy with existing institutions, men have thought of the Parliament of mankind, of a world congress, of a president or emperor of the earth. Our first natural reaction is towards some such conclusion, but the discussion and experiences of half a century of suggestions and attempts has on the whole discouraged belief in that first obvious idea. Along that line to world unity the resistances are too great. The drift of thought seems now to be in the direction of a number of special committees or organizations, with worldwide power delegated to them by existing governments in this group of matters or that, bodies concerned with the waste or development of natural wealth, with the equalization of labor conditions, with world peace, with currency, population and health, and so forth. The world may discover that all its common interests are being managed as one concern, while it still fails to realize that a world government exists. But before even so much human unity is attained, before such international arrangements can be put above patriotic suspicions and jealousies, it is necessary that the common mind of the race should be possessed of that idea of human unity, and that the idea of mankind as one family should be a matter of universal instruction and understanding. For a score of centuries or more, the spirit of the great universal religions has been struggling to maintain and extend that idea of a universal human brotherhood, but to this day the spites, angers and distrusts of tribal, national and racial friction obstruct, and successfully obstruct, the broader views and more generous impulses which would make every man the servant of all mankind. The idea of human brotherhood struggles now to possess the human soul, just as the idea of Christendom struggled to possess the soul of Europe in the confusion and disorder of the 6th and 7th centuries of the Christian era. The dissemination and triumph of such ideas must be the work of a multitude of devoted and undistinguished missionaries, and no contemporary writer can presume to guess how far such work has gone or what harvest it may be preparing. Social and economic questions seem to be inseparably mingled with international ones. The solution in each case lies in an appeal to that same spirit of service which can enter and inspire the human heart. The distrust, intractability, and egotism of nations reflects and is reflected by the distrust, intractability, and egotism of the individual owner and worker in the face of the common good. Exaggerations of possessiveness in the individual are parallel and of a piece with the clutching greed of nations and emperors. They are products of the same instinctive tendencies, and the same ignorances and traditions. Internationalism is the socialism of nations. No one who has wrestled with these problems can feel that there yet exists a sufficient depth and strength of psychological science and a sufficiently planned out educational method and organization for any real and final solution of these riddles of human intercourse and cooperation. We are as incapable of planning a really effective peace organization of the world today as were men in 1820 to plan an electric railway system, but for all we know the thing is equally practicable and may be as nearly at hand. No man can go beyond his own knowledge, no thought can reach beyond contemporary thought, and it is impossible for us to guess or foretell how many generations of humanity may have to live in war and waste and insecurity and misery before the dawn of the great peace to which all history seems to be pointing. Peace in the heart and peace in the world, ends our night of wasteful and aimless living. Our proposed solutions are still vague and crude. Passion and suspicion surround them. A great task of intellectual reconstruction is going on, it is still incomplete, and our conceptions grow clearer and more exact, slowly, rapidly, it is hard to tell which. But as they grow clearer they will gather power over the minds and imaginations of men. Their present lack of grip is due to their lack of assurance and exact rightness. They are misunderstood because they are variously and confusingly presented. But with precision and certainty the new vision of the world will gain compelling power. It may presently gain power very rapidly. And a great work of educational reconstruction will follow logically and necessarily upon that clearer understanding. 60. The expansion of the United States. The region of the world that displayed the most immediate and striking results from the new inventions in transport was North America. Politically the United States embodied, and its constitution crystallized, the liberal ideas of the middle 18th century. It dispensed with state church or crown, it would have no titles, it protected property very jealously as a method of freedom, and the exact practice varied at first in the different states. It gave nearly every adult male citizen a vote. Its method of voting was barbarically crude, and as a consequence its political life fell very soon under the control of highly organized party machines, but that did not prevent the newly emancipated population developing an energy, enterprise, and public spirit far beyond that of any other contemporary population. Then came that acceleration of locomotion to which we have already called attention. It is a curious thing that America, which owes most to this acceleration in locomotion, has felt it least. The United States have taken the railway, the river steamboat, the telegraph, and so forth as though they were a natural part of their growth. They were not. These things happened to come along just in time to save American unity. The United States of today were made first by the river steamboat, and then by the railway. Without these things, the present United States, this vast continental nation, would have been altogether impossible. The westward flow of population would have been far more sluggish. It might never have crossed the Great Central Plains. It took nearly 200 years for effective settlement to reach from the coast to Missouri, much less than halfway across the continent. The first state established beyond the river was the steamboat state of Missouri in 1821. But the rest of the distance to the Pacific was done in a few decades. If we had the resources of the cinema, it would be interesting to show a map of North America year by year from 1600 onward, with little dots to represent hundreds of people, each dot 100, and stars to represent cities of 100,000 people. For 200 years the reader would see that stippling creeping slowly along the coastal districts and navigable waters, spreading still more gradually into Indiana, Kentucky, and so forth. Then somewhere about 1810 would come a change. Things would get more lively along the river courses. The dots would be multiplying and spreading. That would be the steamboat. The pioneer dots would be spreading soon over Kansas and Nebraska from a number of jumping-off places along the great rivers. Then from about 1850 onward would come the black lines of the railways, and after that the little black dots would not simply creep but run. They would appear now so rapidly, it would be almost as though they were being put on by some sort of spraying machine. And suddenly here and then there would appear the first stars to indicate the first great cities of 100,000 people. First one or two and then a multitude of cities, each like a knot in the growing net of the railways. The growth of the United States is a process that has no precedent in the world's history. It is a new kind of occurrence. Such a community could not have come into existence before, and if it had, without railways it would certainly have dropped to pieces long before now. Without railways or telegraph it would be far easier to administer California from Pekin than from Washington. But this great population of the United States of America has not only grown outrageously, it has kept uniform. Nay, it has become more uniform. The man of San Francisco is more like the man of New York today than the man of Virginia was like the man of New England a century ago. And the process of assimilation goes on unimpeded. The United States is being woven by railway, by telegraph, more and more into one vast unity, speaking, thinking and acting harmoniously with itself. Soon aviation will be helping in the work. This great community of the United States is an altogether new thing in history. There have been great empires before with populations exceeding 100 millions, but these were associations of divergent peoples. There has never been one single people on this scale before. We want a new term for this new thing. We call the United States a country just as we call France or Holland a country. But the two things are as different as an automobile and a one-horse shay. They are the creations of different periods and different conditions. They are going to work at a different pace and in an entirely different way. The United States in scale and possibility is halfway between a European state and a United States of all the world. But on the way to this present greatness and security the American people passed through one phase of dire conflict. The river steamboats, the railways, the telegraph, and their associate facilities, did not come soon enough to avert a deepening conflict of interests and ideas between the southern and northern states of the Union. The former were slave-holding states, the latter, states in which all men were free. The railways and steamboats at first did but bring into sharper conflict an already established difference between the two sections of the United States. The increasing unification due to the new means of transport made the question whether the southern spirit or the northern should prevail an ever more urgent one. There was little possibility of compromise. The northern spirit was free and individualistic, the southern made for great estates and a conscious gentility ruling over a dusky subject multitude. Every new territory that was organized into a state as the tide of population swept westward, every new incorporation into the fast-growing American system, became a field of conflict between the two ideas, whether it should become a state of free citizens, or whether the estate and slavery system should prevail. From 1833 an American anti-slavery society was not merely resisting the extension of the institution but agitating the whole country for its complete abolition. The issue flamed up into open conflict over the admission of Texas to the Union. Texas had originally been a part of the Republic of Mexico, but it was largely colonized by Americans from the slave-holding states, and it seceded from Mexico, established its independence in 1835, and was annexed to the United States in 1844. Under the Mexican law, slavery had been forbidden in Texas, but now the South claimed Texas for slavery and got it. Meanwhile, the development of ocean navigation was bringing a growing swarm of immigrants from Europe to swell the spreading population of the northern states, and the raising of Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Oregon, all northern farmlands, to state level, gave the anti-slavery North the possibility of predominance both in the Senate and the House of Representatives. The cotton-growing South, irritated by the growing threat of the abolitionist movement, and fearing this predominance in Congress, began to talk of secession from the Union. Southerners began to dream of annexations to the south of them in Mexico and the West Indies, and of great slave state, detached from the North and reaching to Panama. The return of Abraham Lincoln as an anti-extension president in 1860 decided the South to split the Union. South Carolina passed an ordinance of secession and prepared for war. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas joined her, and a convention met at Montgomery in Alabama, elected Jefferson Davis president of the Confederated States of America, and adopted a constitution specifically upholding the institution of Negro slavery. Abraham Lincoln was, it chanced, a man entirely typical of the new people that had grown up after the War of Independence. His early years had been spent as a drifting particle in the general westward flow of the population. He was born in Kentucky, 1809, was taken to Indiana as a boy and later on to Illinois. Life was rough in the backwoods of Indiana in those days. The house was a mere log cabin in the wilderness, and his schooling was poor and casual. But his mother taught him to read early, and he became a voracious reader. At 17 he was a big athletic youth, a great wrestler and runner. He worked for a time as clerk in a store, went into business as a storekeeper with a drunken partner, and contracted debts that he did not fully pay off for 15 years. In 1834, when he was still only 25, he was elected member of the House of Representatives for the state of Illinois. In Illinois particularly, the question of slavery flamed because the great leader of the party for the extension of slavery in the National Congress was Senator Douglas of Illinois. Douglas was a man of great ability and prestige, and for some years Lincoln fought against him by speech and pamphlet, rising steadily to the position of his most formidable and finally victorious antagonist. Their culminating struggle was the presidential campaign of 1860, and on the 4th of March, 1861, Lincoln was inaugurated president, with the southern states already in active secession from the rule of the federal government at Washington, and committing acts of war. This civil war in America was fought by improvised armies that grew steadily from a few score thousands to hundreds of thousands, until at last the federal forces exceeded 1 million men. It was fought over a vast area between New Mexico and the Eastern Sea. Washington and Richmond were the chief objectives. It is beyond our scope here to tell of the mounting energy of that epic struggle that rolled to and fro across the hills and woods of Tennessee and Virginia and down the Mississippi. There was a terrible waste and killing of men. Thrust was followed by counter-thrust, hope gave way to despondency, and returned and was again disappointed. Sometimes Washington seemed within the Confederate grasp, again the Federal armies were driving towards Richmond. The Confederates, outnumbered and far poorer in resources, fought under a general of supreme ability, General Lee. The generalship of the Union was far inferior. Generals were dismissed, new generals appointed, until at last, under Sherman and Grant, came victory over the ragged and depleted South. In October 1864, a Federal army under Sherman broke through the Confederate left and marched down from Tennessee through Georgia to the coast, right across the Confederate country, and then turned up through the Carolinas, coming in upon the rear of the Confederate armies. Meanwhile, Grant held Lee before Richmond until Sherman closed on him. On April 9, 1865, Lee and his army surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, and within a month all the remaining secessionist armies had laid down their arms and the Confederacy was at an end. This 4-year struggle had meant an enormous physical and moral strain for the people of the United States. The principle of state autonomy was very dear to many minds, and the North seemed in effect to be forcing abolition upon the South. In the border states, brothers and cousins, even fathers and sons, would take opposite sides and find themselves in antagonistic armies. The North felt its cause a righteous one, but for great numbers of people it was not a full-bodied and unchallenged righteousness. But for Lincoln there was no doubt. He was a clear-minded man in the midst of much confusion. He stood for union, he stood for the wide peace of America. He was opposed to slavery, but slavery he held to be a secondary issue. His primary purpose was that the United States should not be torn into two contrasted and jarring fragments. When in the opening stages of the war Congress and the Federal generals embarked upon a precipitate emancipation, Lincoln opposed and mitigated their enthusiasm. He was for emancipation by stages and with compensation. It was only in January 1865 that the situation had ripened to a point when Congress could propose to abolish slavery forever by a constitutional amendment, and the war was already over before this amendment was ratified by the states. As the war dragged on through 1862 and 1863, the first passions and enthusiasms waned, and America learnt all the phases of war weariness and war disgust. The president found himself with defeatists, traitors, dismissed generals, tortuous party politicians, and a doubting and fatigued people behind him and uninspired generals and depressed troops before him. His chief consolation must have been that Jefferson Davis at Richmond could be in little better case. The English government misbehaved, and permitted the Confederate agents in England to launch and man 3 swift privateer ships, the Alabama is the best remembered of them, which chased United States shipping from the seas. The French army in Mexico was trampling the Monroe Doctrine in the dirt. Came subtle proposals from Richmond to drop the war, leave the issues of the war for subsequent discussion, and turn, Federal and Confederate in alliance, upon the French in Mexico. But Lincoln would not listen to such proposals unless the supremacy of the Union was maintained. The Americans might do such things as one people but not as two. He held the United States together through long weary months of reverses and ineffective effort, through black phases of division and failing courage, and there is no record that he ever faltered from his purpose. There were times when there was nothing to be done, when he sat in the White House silent and motionless, a grim monument of resolve, times when he relaxed his mind by jesting and broad anecdotes. He saw the Union triumphant. He entered Richmond the day after its surrender, and heard of Lee's capitulation. He returned to Washington, and on April 11 made his last public address. His theme was reconciliation and the reconstruction of loyal government in the defeated states. On the evening of April 14 he went to Ford's Theatre in Washington, and as he sat looking at the stage, he was shot in the back of the head and killed by an actor named Booth who had some sort of grievance against him, and who had crept into the box unobserved. But Lincoln's work was done, the Union was saved. At the beginning of the war there was no railway to the Pacific coast. After it the railways spread like a swiftly growing plant until now they have clutched and held and woven all the vast territory of the United States into one indissoluble mental and material unity, the greatest real community until the common folk of China have learnt to read, in the world. 61. The rise of Germany to predominance in Europe. We have told how after the convulsion of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic adventure, Europe settled down again for a time to an insecure peace and a sort of modernized revival of the political conditions of 50 years before. Until the middle of the century the new facilities in the handling of steel and the railway and steamship produced no marked political consequences. But the social tension due to the development of urban industrialism grew. France remained a conspicuously uneasy country. The Revolution of 1830 was followed by another in 1848. Then Napoleon III, a nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, became first president, and then, in 1852, emperor. He set about rebuilding Paris, and changed it from a picturesque 17th-century insanitary city into the spacious Latinized city of marble it is today. He set about rebuilding France, and made it into a brilliant-looking modernized imperialism. He displayed a disposition to revive that competitiveness of the great powers which had kept Europe busy with futile wars during the 17th and 18th centuries. The Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, 1825 to 1856, was also becoming aggressive and pressing southward upon the Turkish Empire with his eyes on Constantinople. After the turn of the century, Europe broke out into a fresh cycle of wars. They were chiefly balance of power and ascendancy wars. England, France, and Sardinia assailed Russia in the Crimean War in defense of Turkey. Prussia, with Italy as an ally, and Austria fought for the leadership of Germany. France liberated North Italy from Austria at the price of Savoy, and Italy gradually unified itself into one kingdom. Then Napoleon III was so ill-advised as to attempt adventures in Mexico. During the American Civil War, he set up an Emperor Maximilian there and abandoned him hastily to his fate. He was shot by the Mexicans when the victorious federal government showed its teeth. In 1870 came a long-pending struggle for predominance in Europe between France and Prussia. Prussia had long foreseen and prepared for this struggle, and France was rotten with financial corruption. Her defeat was swift and dramatic. The Germans invaded France in August. One great French army under the emperor capitulated at Sedan in September, another surrendered in October at Metz, and in January 1871, Paris, after a siege and bombardment, fell into German hands. Peace was signed at Frankfurt, surrendering the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine to the Germans. Germany, excluding Austria, was unified as an empire, and the King of Prussia was added to the galaxy of European Caesars, as the German emperor. For the next 43 years Germany was the leading power upon the European continent. There was a Russo-Turkish War in 1877–8, but thereafter, except for certain readjustments in the Balkans, European frontiers remained uneasily stable for 30 years. 62. The new overseas empires of steamship and railway. The end of the 18th century was a period of disrupting empires and disillusioned expansionists. The long and tedious journey between Britain and Spain and their colonies in America prevented any really free coming and going between the homeland and the daughter lands, and so the colonies separated into new and distinct communities, with distinctive ideas and interests and even modes of speech. As they grew, they strained more and more at the feeble and uncertain link of shipping that had joined them. Weak trading posts in the wilderness, like those of France in Canada, or trading establishments in great alien communities, like those of Britain in India, might well cling for bare existence to the nation which gave them support and a reason for their existence. That much and no more seemed to many thinkers in the early part of the 19th century to be the limit set to overseas rule. In 1820 the sketchy great European empires outside of Europe that had figured so bravely in the maps of the middle 18th century, had shrunken to very small dimensions. Only the Russian sprawled as large as ever across Asia. The British Empire in 1815 consisted of the thinly populated coastal river and lake regions of Canada, and a great hinterland of wilderness in which the only settlements as yet were the fur trading stations of the Hudson Bay Company, about a third of the Indian Peninsula, under the rule of the East India Company, the coast districts of the Cape of Good Hope inhabited by blacks and rebellious-spirited Dutch settlers, a few trading stations on the coast of West Africa, the Rock of Gibraltar, the island of Malta, Jamaica, a few minor slave labor possessions in the West Indies, British Guiana in South America, and, on the other side of the world, 2 dumps for convicts at Botany Bay in Australia and in Tasmania. Spain retained Cuba and a few settlements in the Philippine Islands. Portugal had in Africa some vestiges of her ancient claims. Holland had various islands and possessions in the East Indies and Dutch Guiana, and Denmark an island or so in the West Indies. France had 1 or 2 West Indian islands and French Guiana. This seemed to be as much as the European powers needed, or were likely to acquire of the rest of the world. Only the East India Company showed any spirit of expansion. While Europe was busy with the Napoleonic Wars, the East India Company, under a succession of governors-general, was playing much the same role in India that had been played before by Turkoman and such-like invaders from the north. And after the Peace of Vienna it went on, levying its revenues, making wars, sending ambassadors to Asiatic powers, a quasi-independent state, however, with a marked disposition to send wealth westward. We cannot tell here in any detail how the British Company made its way to supremacy, sometimes as the ally of this power, sometimes as that, and finally as the conqueror of all. Its power spread to Assam, Sindh, Oudh. The map of India began to take on the outlines familiar to the English schoolboy of today, a patchwork of native states embraced and held together by the great provinces under direct British rule. In 1859, following upon a serious mutiny of the native troops in India, this empire of the East India Company was annexed to the British Crown. By an act entitled An Act for the Better Government of India, the Governor-General became a viceroy representing the sovereign, and the place of the company was taken by a Secretary of State for India responsible to the British Parliament. In 1877, Lord Beaconsfield, to complete the work, caused Queen Victoria to be proclaimed Empress of India. Upon these extraordinary lines India and Britain are linked at the present time. India is still the empire of the Great Mogul, but the Great Mogul has been replaced by the Crowned Republic of Great Britain. India is an autocracy without an autocrat. Its rule combines the disadvantage of absolute monarchy with the impersonality and irresponsibility of democratic officialdom. The Indian with a complaint to make has no visible monarch to go to. His emperor is a golden symbol. He must circulate pamphlets in England or inspire a question in the British House of Commons. The more occupied Parliament is with British affairs, the less attention India will receive, and the more she will be at the mercy of her small group of higher officials. Apart from India, there was no great expansion of any European empire until the railways and the steamships were in effective action. A considerable school of political thinkers in Britain was disposed to regard overseas possessions as a source of weakness to the kingdom. The Australian settlements developed slowly until in 1842 the discovery of valuable copper mines, and in 1851 of gold, gave them a new importance. Improvements in transport were also making Australian wool an increasingly marketable commodity in Europe. Canada, too, was not remarkably progressive until 1849. It was troubled by dissensions between its French and British inhabitants. There were several serious revolts, and it was only in 1867 that a new constitution creating a federal dominion of Canada relieved its internal strains. It was the railway that altered the Canadian outlook. It enabled Canada, just as it enabled the United States, to expand westward, to market its corn and other produce in Europe, and in spite of its swift and extensive growth, to remain in language and sympathy and interests one community. The railway, the steamship and the telegraph cable were indeed changing all the conditions of colonial development. Before 1840, English settlements had already begun in New Zealand, and a New Zealand Land Company had been formed to exploit the possibilities of the island. In 1840 New Zealand also was added to the colonial possessions of the British Crown. Canada, as we have noted, was the first of the British possessions to respond richly to the new economic possibilities that the new methods of transport were opening. Presently the republics of South America, and particularly the Argentine Republic, began to feel in their cattle trade and coffee growing the increased nearness of the European market. Hitherto the chief commodities that had attracted the European powers into unsettled and barbaric regions had been gold or other metals, spices, ivory, or slaves. But in the latter quarter of the 19th century the increase of the European populations was obliging their governments to look abroad for staple foods, and the growth of scientific industrialism was creating a demand for new raw materials, fats and greases of every kind, rubber, and other hitherto disregarded substances. It was plain that Great Britain and Holland and Portugal were reaping a great and growing commercial advantage from their very considerable control of tropical and subtropical products. After 1871, Germany, and presently France and later Italy, began to look for unannexed raw material areas, or for Oriental countries capable of profitable modernization. So began a fresh scramble all over the world, except in the American region where the Monroe Doctrine now barred such adventures, for politically unprotected lands. Close to Europe was the continent of Africa, full of vaguely known possibilities. In 1850 it was a continent of black mystery, only Egypt and the coast were known. Here we have no space to tell the amazing story of the explorers and adventurers who first pierced the African darkness, and of the political agents, administrators, traders, settlers, and scientific men who followed in their track. Wonderful races of men like the pygmies, strange beasts like the okapi, marvelous fruits and flowers and insects, terrible diseases, astounding scenery of forest and mountain, enormous inland seas and gigantic rivers and cascades were revealed, a whole new world. Even remains, at Zimbabwe, of some unrecorded and vanished civilization, the southward enterprise of an early people, were discovered. Into this new world came the Europeans, and found the rifle already there in the hands of the Arab slave traders, and Negro life in disorder. By 1900, in half a century, all Africa was mapped, explored, estimated, and divided between the European powers. Little heed was given to the welfare of the natives in this scramble. The Arab slaver was indeed curbed rather than expelled, but the greed for rubber, which was a wild product collected under compulsion by the natives in the Belgian Congo, a greed exacerbated by the clash of inexperienced European administrators with the native population, led to horrible atrocities. No European power has perfectly clean hands in this matter. We cannot tell here in any detail how Great Britain got possession of Egypt in 1883 and remained there in spite of the fact that Egypt was technically a part of the Turkish Empire, nor how nearly this scramble led to war between France and Great Britain in 1898, when a certain Colonel Marchand, crossing Central Africa from the west coast, tried at Fashoda to seize the Upper Nile. Nor can we tell how the British government first let the Boers, or Dutch settlers, of the Orange River District and the Transvaal set up independent republics in the inland parts of South Africa, and then repented and annexed the Transvaal Republic in 1877, nor how the Transvaal Boers fought for freedom and won it after the Battle of Majabahill, 1881. Majabahill was made to rankle in the memory of the English people by a persistent press campaign. A war with both republics broke out in 1899, a 3 years' war enormously costly to the British people, which ended at last in the surrender of the two republics. Their period of subjugation was a brief one. In 1907, after the downfall of the imperialist government which had conquered them, the Liberals took the South African problem in hand, and these former republics became free and fairly willing associates with Cape Colony and Natal in a confederation of all the states of South Africa as one self-governing republic under the British Crown. In a quarter of a century the partition of Africa was completed. There remained unannexed 3 comparatively small countries: Liberia, a settlement of liberated Negro slaves on the west coast, Morocco, under a Muslim sultan, and Abyssinia, a barbaric country, with an ancient and peculiar form of Christianity, which had successfully maintained its independence against Italy at the Battle of Adowa in 1896. 63. European aggression in Asia and the rise of Japan. It is difficult to believe that any large number of people really accepted this headlong painting of the map of Africa in European colors as a permanent new settlement of the world's affairs, but it is the duty of the historian to record that it was so accepted. There was but a shallow historical background to the European mind in the 19th century, and no habit of penetrating criticism. The quite temporary advantages that the mechanical revolution in the West had given the Europeans over the rest of the Old World were regarded by people, blankly ignorant of such events as the great Mongol conquests, as evidences of a permanent and assured European leadership of mankind. They had no sense of the transferability of science and its fruits. They did not realize that Chinamen and Indians could carry on the work of research as ably as Frenchmen or Englishmen. They believed that there was some innate intellectual drive in the West, and some innate indolence and conservatism in the East, that assured the Europeans a world predominance forever. The consequence of this infatuation was that the various European foreign offices set themselves not merely to scramble with the British for the savage and undeveloped regions of the world's surface, but also to carve up the populous and civilized countries of Asia as though these people also were no more than raw material for exploitation. The inwardly precarious but outwardly splendid imperialism of the British ruling class in India, and the extensive and profitable possessions of the Dutch in the East Indies, filled the rival great powers with dreams of similar glories in Persia, in the disintegrating Ottoman Empire, and in further India, China, and Japan. In 1898 Germany seized Kiaochao in China. Britain responded by seizing Weihai, and the next year the Russians took possession of Port Arthur. A flame of hatred for the Europeans swept through China. There were massacres of Europeans and Christian converts, and in 1900 an attack upon and siege of the European legations in Pekin. A combined force of Europeans made a punitive expedition to Pekin, rescued the legations, and stole an enormous amount of valuable property. The Russians then seized Manchuria, and in 1904, the British invaded Tibet. But now a new power appeared in the struggle of the great powers, Japan. Hitherto Japan has played but a small part in this history. Her secluded civilization has not contributed very largely to the general shaping of human destinies. She has received much, but she has given little. The Japanese proper are of the Mongolian race. Their civilization, their writing, and their literary and artistic traditions are derived from the Chinese. Their history is an interesting and romantic one. They developed a feudal system and a system of chivalry in the earlier centuries of the Christian era. Their attacks upon Korea and China are an Eastern equivalent of the English wars in France. Japan was first brought into contact with Europe in the 16th century. In 1542 some Portuguese reached it in a Chinese junk, and in 1549 a Jesuit missionary, Francis Xavier, began his teaching there. For a time Japan welcomed European intercourse, and the Christian missionaries made a great number of converts. A certain William Adams became the most trusted European advisor of the Japanese, and showed them how to build big ships. There were voyages in Japanese-built ships to India and Peru. Then arose complicated quarrels between the Spanish Dominicans, the Portuguese Jesuits, and the English and Dutch Protestants, each warning the Japanese against the political designs of the others. The Jesuits, in a phase of ascendancy, persecuted and insulted the Buddhists with great acrimony. In the end the Japanese came to the conclusion that the Europeans were an intolerable nuisance, and that Catholic Christianity in particular was a mere cloak for the political dreams of the Pope and the Spanish monarchy already in possession of the Philippine Islands. There was a great persecution of the Christians, and in 1638 Japan was absolutely closed to Europeans, and remained closed for over 200 years. During those 2 centuries the Japanese were as completely cut off from the rest of the world as though they lived upon another planet. It was forbidden to build any ship larger than a mere coasting boat. No Japanese could go abroad, and no European enter the country. For 2 centuries Japan remained outside the main current of history. She lived on in a state of picturesque feudalism in which about 5% of the population, the samurai, or fighting men, and the nobles and their families, tyrannized without restraint over the rest of the population. Meanwhile the great world outside went on to wider visions and new powers. Strange shipping became more frequent, passing the Japanese headlands. Sometimes ships were wrecked and sailors brought ashore. Through the Dutch settlement in the island of Decima, their one link with the outer universe, came warnings that Japan was not keeping pace with the power of the Western world. In 1837 a ship sailed into Yedo Bay flying a strange flag of stripes and stars, and carrying some Japanese sailors she had picked up far adrift in the Pacific. She was driven off by cannon shot. This flag presently reappeared on other ships. One in 1849 came to demand the liberation of 18 shipwrecked American sailors. Then in 1853 came 4 American warships under Commodore Perry, and refused to be driven away. He lay at anchor in forbidden waters, and sent messages to the two rulers who at that time shared the control of Japan. In 1854 he returned with 10 ships, amazing ships propelled by steam, and equipped with big guns, and he made proposals for trade and intercourse that the Japanese had no power to resist. He landed with a guard of 500 men to sign the treaty. Incredulous crowds watched this visitation from the outer world, marching through the streets. Russia, Holland, and Britain followed in the wake of America. A great nobleman whose estates commanded the Straits of Shimonoseki saw fit to fire on foreign vessels, and a bombardment by a fleet of British, French, Dutch, and American warships destroyed his batteries and scattered his swordsmen. Finally, an Allied squadron, 1865, at anchor off Kyoto, imposed a ratification of the treaties which opened Japan to the world. The humiliation of the Japanese by these events was intense. With astonishing energy and intelligence, they set themselves to bring their culture and organization to the level of the European powers. Never in all the history of mankind did a nation make such a stride as Japan then did. In 1866 she was a medieval people, a fantastic caricature of the extremist romantic feudalism. In 1899 hers was a completely westernized people, on a level with the most advanced European powers. She completely dispelled the persuasion that Asia was in some irrevocable way hopelessly behind Europe. She made all European progress seem sluggish by comparison. We cannot tell here in any detail of Japan's war with China in 1894–95. It demonstrated the extent of her westernization. She had an efficient westernized army and a small but sound fleet. But the significance of her renaissance, though it was appreciated by Britain and the United States, who were already treating her as if she were a European state, was not understood by the other great powers engaged in the pursuit of new Indias in Asia. Russia was pushing down through Manchuria to Korea. France was already established far to the south in Tonkin and Annam. Germany was prowling hungrily on the lookout for some settlement. The three powers combined to prevent Japan reaping any fruits from the Chinese War. She was exhausted by the struggle, and they threatened her with war. Japan submitted for a time and gathered her forces. Within 10 years she was ready for a struggle with Russia, which marks an epoch in the history of Asia, the close of the period of European arrogance. The Russian people were, of course, innocent and ignorant of this trouble that was being made for them halfway round the world, and the wiser Russian statesmen were against these foolish thrusts, but a gang of financial adventurers, including the Grand Dukes, his cousins, surrounded the Tsar. They had gambled deeply in the prospective looting of Manchuria and China, and they would suffer no withdrawal. So there began a transportation of great armies of Japanese soldiers across the sea to Port Arthur and Korea, and the sending of endless trainloads of Russian peasants along the Siberian Railway to die in those distant battlefields. The Russians, badly led and dishonestly provided, were beaten on sea and land alike. The Russian Baltic fleet sailed round Africa to be utterly destroyed in the Straits of Tsushima. A revolutionary movement among the common people of Russia, infuriated by this remote and reasonless slaughter, obliged the Tsar to end the war. 1905, he returned the southern half of Saghalien, which had been seized by Russia in 1875, evacuated Manchuria, resigned Korea to Japan. The European invasion of Asia was coming to an end and the retraction of Europe's tentacles was beginning. 64. The British Empire in 1914. We may note here briefly the varied nature of the constituents of the British Empire in 1914 which the steamship and railway had brought together. It was and is a quite unique political combination. Nothing of the sort has ever existed before. First and central to the whole system was the Crowned Republic of the United British Kingdom, including, against the will of a considerable part of the Irish people, Ireland. The majority of the British Parliament, made up of the three united parliaments of England and Wales, Scotland and Ireland, determines the headship, the quality and policy of the ministry, and determines it largely on considerations arising out of British domestic politics. It is this ministry which is the effective supreme government, with powers of peace and war, over all the rest of the empire. Next in order of political importance to the British states were the crowned republics of Australia, Canada, Newfoundland, the oldest British possession, 1583, New Zealand and South Africa, all practically independent and self-governing states in alliance with Great Britain, but each with a representative of the Crown appointed by the government in office. Next, the Indian Empire, an extension of the empire of the Great Mogul with its dependent and protected states reaching now from Baluchistan to Burma, and including Aden, in all of which empire the British Crown and the India Office, under parliamentary control, played the role of the original Turkoman dynasty. Then the ambiguous possession of Egypt, still nominally a part of the Turkish Empire and still retaining its own monarch, the Khedive, but under almost despotic British official rule. Then the still more ambiguous Anglo-Egyptian Sudan province, occupied and administered jointly by the British and by the British-controlled Egyptian government. Then a number of partially self-governing communities, some British in origin and some not, with elected legislatures and an appointed executive, such as Malta, Jamaica, the Bahamas and Bermuda. Then the Crown colonies, in which the rule of the British Home Government, through the Colonial Office, verged on autocracy, as in Ceylon, Trinidad and Fiji, where there was an appointed council, and Gibraltar and St. Helena, where there was a governor. Then great areas of, chiefly, tropical lands, raw product areas, with politically weak and under-civilized native communities which were nominally protectorates, and administered either by a high commissioner set over native chiefs, as in Basutoland, or over a chartered company, as in Rhodesia. In some cases the Foreign Office, in some cases the Colonial Office, and in some cases the India Office, has been concerned in acquiring the possessions that fell into this last and least definite class of all, but for the most part the Colonial Office was now responsible for them. It will be manifest, therefore, that no single office and no single brain had ever comprehended the British Empire as a whole. It was a mixture of growths and accumulations entirely different from anything that has ever been called an empire before. It guaranteed a wide peace and security, that is why it was endured and sustained by many men of the subject races, in spite of official tyrannies and insufficiencies, and of much negligence on the part of the home public. Like the Athenian Empire, it was an overseas empire, its ways were sea ways, and its common link was the British Navy. Like all empires, its cohesion was dependent physically upon a method of communication. The development of seamanship, shipbuilding, and steamships between the 16th and 19th centuries had made it a possible and convenient pax, the Pax Britannica, and fresh developments of air or swift land transport might at any time make it inconvenient. 65. The Age of Armament in Europe, and the Great War of 1914–18. The progress in material science that created this vast steamboat and railway republic of America and spread this precarious British steamship empire over the world, produced quite other effects upon the congested nations upon the continent of Europe. They found themselves confined within boundaries fixed during the horse and highroad period of human life, and their expansion overseas had been very largely anticipated by Great Britain. Only Russia had any freedom to expand eastward, and she drove a great railway across Siberia until she entangled herself in a conflict with Japan, and pushed southeastwardly towards the borders of Persia and India to the annoyance of Britain. The rest of the European powers were in a state of intensifying congestion. In order to realize the full possibilities of the new apparatus of human life, they had to rearrange their affairs upon a broader basis, either by some sort of voluntary union or by a union imposed upon them by some predominant power. The tendency of modern thought was in the direction of the former alternative, but all the force of political tradition drove Europe towards the latter. The downfall of the empire of Napoleon III, the establishment of the new German Empire, pointed men's hopes and fears towards the idea of a Europe consolidated under German auspices. For 36 years of uneasy peace the polities of Europe centered upon that possibility. France, the steadfast rival of Germany for European ascendancy since the division of the Empire of Charlemagne, sought to correct her own weakness by a close alliance with Russia, and Germany linked herself closely with the Austrian Empire, it had ceased to be the Holy Roman Empire in the days of Napoleon I, and less successfully with the new Kingdom of Italy. At first Great Britain stood as usual half in and half out of continental affairs. But she was gradually forced into a close association with the Franco-Russian group by the aggressive development of a great German navy. The grandiose imagination of the Emperor William II, 1888 to 1918, thrust Germany into premature overseas enterprise that ultimately brought not only Great Britain but Japan and the United States into the circle of her enemies. All these nations armed. Year after year the proportion of national production devoted to the making of guns, equipment, battleships and the like, increased. Year after year the balance of things seemed trembling towards war, and then war would be averted. At last it came. Germany and Austria struck at France and Russia and Serbia, the German armies marching through Belgium. Britain immediately came into the war on the side of Belgium, bringing in Japan as her ally, and very soon Turkey followed on the German side. Italy entered the war against Austria in 1915, and Bulgaria joined the Central Powers in the October of that year. In 1916 Romania, and in 1917 the United States and China were forced into war against Germany. It is not within the scope of this history to define the exact share of blame for this vast catastrophe. The more interesting question is not why the Great War was begun but why the Great War was not anticipated and prevented. It is a far graver thing for mankind that scores of millions of people were too patriotic, stupid, or apathetic to prevent this disaster by a movement towards European unity upon frank and generous lines, than that a small number of people may have been active in bringing it about. It is impossible within the space at our command here to trace the intricate details of the war. Within a few months it became apparent that the progress of modern technical science had changed the nature of warfare very profoundly. Physical science gives power over skill, over distance, over disease. Whether that power is used well or ill depends upon the moral and political intelligence of the world. The governments of Europe, inspired by antiquated policies of hate and suspicion, found themselves with unexampled powers both of destruction and resistance in their hands. The war became a consuming fire round and about the world, causing losses both to victors and vanquished out of all proportion to the issues involved. The first phase of the war was a tremendous rush of the Germans upon Paris and an invasion of East Prussia by the Russians. Both attacks were held and turned. Then the power of the defensive developed. There was a rapid elaboration of trench warfare until for a time the opposing armies lay entrenched in long lines right across Europe, unable to make any advance without enormous losses. The armies were millions strong, and behind them entire populations were organized for the supply of food and munitions to the front. Then was a cessation of nearly every sort of productive activity except such as contributed to military operations. All the able-bodied manhood of Europe was drawn into the armies or navies or into the improvised factories that served them. There was an enormous replacement of men by women in industry. Probably more than half the people in the belligerent countries of Europe changed their employment altogether during this stupendous struggle. They were socially uprooted and transplanted. Education and normal scientific work were restricted or diverted to immediate military ends, and the distribution of news was crippled and corrupted by military control and propaganda activities. The phase of military deadlock passed slowly into one of aggression upon the combatant populations behind the fronts by the destruction of food supplies and by attacks through the air. And also there was a steady improvement in the size and range of the guns employed and of such ingenious devices as poison gas shells and the small mobile forts known as tanks, to break down the resistance of troops in the trenches. The air offensive was the most revolutionary of all the new methods. It carried warfare from 2 dimensions into 3. Hitherto in the history of mankind war had gone on only where the armies marched and met. Now it went on everywhere. First the Zeppelin and then the bombing aeroplane carried war over and past the front to an ever-increasing area of civilian activities beyond. The old distinction maintained in civilized warfare between the civilian and combatant population disappeared. Everyone who grew food, or who sewed a garment, everyone who felled a tree or repaired a house, every railway station and every warehouse was held to be fair game for destruction. The air offensive increased in range and terror with every month in the war. At last great areas of Europe were in a state of siege and subject to nightly raids. Such exposed cities as London and Paris passed sleepless night after sleepless night while the bombs burst, the anti-aircraft guns maintained an intolerable racket, and the fire engines and ambulances rattled headlong through the darkened and deserted streets. The effects upon the minds and health of old people and of young children were particularly distressing and destructive. Pestilence, that old follower of warfare, did not arrive until the very end of the fighting in 1918. For 4 years medical science staved off any general epidemic, then came a great outbreak of influenza about the world which destroyed many millions of people. Famine also was staved off for some time. By the beginning of 1918, however, most of Europe was in a state of mitigated and regulated famine. The production of food throughout the world had fallen very greatly through the calling off of peasant mankind to the fronts, and the distribution of such food as was produced was impeded by the havoc wrought by the submarine, by the rupture of customary routes through the closing of frontiers, and by the disorganization of the transport system of the world. The various governments took possession of the dwindling food supplies, and, with more or less success, rationed their populations. By the 4th year the whole world was suffering from shortages of clothing and housing and of most of the normal gear of life as well as of food. Business and economic life were profoundly disorganized. Everyone was worried, and most people were leading lives of unwonted discomfort. The actual warfare ceased in November 1918. After a supreme effort in the spring of 1918 that almost carried the Germans to Paris, the Central Powers collapsed. They had come to an end of their spirit and resources. 66. The Revolution and Famine in Russia. But a good year and more before the collapse of the Central Powers, the half-Oriental monarchy of Russia, which had professed to be the continuation of the Byzantine Empire, had collapsed. The Tsardom had been showing signs of profound rottenness for some years before the war. The court was under the sway of a fantastic religious impostor, Rasputin, and the public administration, civil and military, was in a state of extreme inefficiency and corruption. At the outset of the war there was a great flare of patriotic enthusiasm in Russia. A vast conscript army was called up, for which there was neither adequate military equipment nor a proper supply of competent officers, and this great host, ill-supplied and badly handled, was hurled against the German and Austrian frontiers. There can be no doubt that the early appearance of Russian armies in East Prussia in September 1914 diverted the energies and attention of the Germans from their first victorious drive upon Paris. The sufferings and deaths of scores of thousands of ill-led Russian peasants saved France from complete overthrow in that momentous opening campaign, and made all Western Europe the debtors of that great and tragic people. But the strain of the war upon this sprawling, ill-organized empire was too heavy for its strength. The Russian common soldiers were sent into battle without guns to support them, without even rifle ammunition. They were wasted by their officers and generals in a delirium of militarist enthusiasm. For a time they seemed to be suffering mutely as the beasts suffer, but there is a limit to the endurance even of the most ignorant. A profound disgust for Tsardom was creeping through these armies of betrayed and wasted men. From the close of 1915 onward, Russia was a source of deepening anxiety to her Western allies. Throughout 1916 she remained largely on the defensive, and there were rumors of a separate peace with Germany. On December 29, 1916, the monk Rasputin was murdered at a dinner party in Petrograd, and a belated attempt was made to put the Tsardom in order. By March things were moving rapidly. Food riots in Petrograd developed into a revolutionary insurrection. There was an attempted suppression of the Duma, the representative body. There were attempted arrests of liberal leaders, the formation of a provisional government under Prince Lvov, and an abdication, March 15, by the Tsar. For a time it seemed that a moderate and controlled revolution might be possible, perhaps under a new Tsar. Then it became evident that the destruction of popular confidence in Russia had gone too far for any such adjustments. The Russian people were sick to death of the old order of things in Europe, of tsars and wars and of great powers. It wanted relief, and that speedily, from unendurable miseries. The Allies had no understanding of Russian realities. Their diplomatists were ignorant of Russian, genteel persons with their attention directed to the Russian court rather than to Russia. They blundered steadily with the new situation. There was little goodwill among these diplomatists for republicanism, and a manifest disposition to embarrass the new government as much as possible. At the head of the Russian Republican government was an eloquent and picturesque leader, Kerensky, who found himself assailed by the forces of a profounder revolutionary movement, the social revolution, at home and cold-shouldered by the Allied governments abroad. His allies would neither let him give the Russian peasants the land for which they craved nor peace beyond their frontiers. The French and the British press pestered their exhausted ally for a fresh offensive, but when presently the Germans made a strong attack by sea and land upon Riga, the British Admiralty quailed before the prospect of a Baltic expedition in relief. The new Russian Republic had to fight unsupported. In spite of their naval predominance and the bitter protests of the great English admiral, Lord Fisher, 1841–1920, it is to be noted that the British and their allies, except for some submarine attacks, left the Germans the complete mastery of the Baltic throughout the war. The Russian masses, however, were resolute to end the war at any cost. There had come into existence in Petrograd a body representing the workers and common soldiers, the Soviet, and this body clamored for an international conference of socialists at Stockholm. Food riots were occurring in Berlin at this time, war weariness in Austria and Germany was profound, and there can be little doubt, in the light of subsequent events, that such a conference would have precipitated a reasonable peace on democratic lines in 1917 and a German revolution. Kerensky implored his Western allies to allow this conference to take place, but, fearful of a worldwide outbreak of socialism and republicanism, they refused, in spite of the favorable response of a small majority of the British Labour Party. Without either moral or physical help from the Allies, the unhappy moderate Russian Republic still fought on and made a last desperate offensive effort in July. It failed after some preliminary successes, and there came another great slaughtering of Russians. The limit of Russian endurance was reached. Mutinies broke out in the Russian armies, and particularly upon the northern front, and on November 7, 1917, Kerensky's government was overthrown and power was seized by the Soviets, dominated by the Bolshevik socialists under Lenin, and pledged to make peace regardless of the Western powers. On March 2, 1918, a separate peace between Russia and Germany was signed at Brest-Litovsk. It speedily became evident that these Bolshevik socialists were men of a very different quality from the rhetorical constitutionalists and revolutionaries of the Kerensky phase. They were fanatical Marxist communists. They believed that their accession to power in Russia was only the opening of a worldwide social revolution, and they set about changing the social and economic order with the thoroughness of perfect faith and absolute inexperience. The Western European and the American governments were themselves much too ill-informed and incapable to guide or help this extraordinary experiment, and the press set itself to discredit and the ruling classes to wreck these usurpers upon any terms and at any cost to themselves or to Russia. A propaganda of abominable and disgusting inventions went on unchecked in the press of the world. The Bolshevik leaders were represented as incredible monsters glutted with blood and plunder and living lives of sensuality before which the realities of the Tsarist court during the Rasputin regime paled to a white purity. Expeditions were launched at the exhausted country, insurgents and raiders were encouraged, armed and subsidized, and no method of attack was too mean or too monstrous for the frightened enemies of the Bolshevik regime. In 1919, the Russian Bolsheviks, ruling a country already exhausted and disorganized by 5 years of intensive warfare, were fighting a British expedition at Archangel, Japanese invaders in eastern Siberia, Romanians with French and Greek contingents in the south, the Russian Admiral Kolchak in Siberia and General Denikin, supported by the French fleet, in the Crimea. In July of that year an Estonian army, under General Yudnich, almost got to Petersburg. In 1920 the Poles, incited by the French, made a new attack on Russia, and a new reactionary raider, General Rangel, took over the task of General Denikin in invading and devastating his own country. In March 1921, the sailors at Kronstadt revolted. The Russian government under its president, Lenin, survived all these various attacks. It showed an amazing tenacity, and the common people of Russia sustained it unswervingly under conditions of extreme hardship. By the end of 1921, both Britain and Italy had made a sort of recognition of the communist rule. But if the Bolshevik government was successful in its struggle against foreign intervention and internal revolt, it was far less happy in its attempts to set up a new social order based upon communist ideas in Russia. The Russian peasant is a small land-hungry proprietor, as far from communism in his thoughts and methods as a whale is from flying. The revolution gave him the land of the great landowners but could not make him grow food for anything but negotiable money, and the revolution, among other things, had practically destroyed the value of money. Agricultural production, already greatly disordered by the collapse of the railways through war strain, shrank to a mere cultivation of food by the peasants for their own consumption. The town starved. Hasty and ill-planned attempts to make over industrial production in accordance with communist ideas were equally unsuccessful. By 1920, Russia presented the unprecedented spectacle of a modern civilization in complete collapse. Railways were rusting and passing out of use, towns were falling into ruin, everywhere there was an immense mortality. Yet the country still fought with its enemies at its gates. In 1921 came a drought and a great famine among the peasant cultivators in the war-devastated southeast provinces. Millions of people starved. But the question of the distresses and the possible recuperation of Russia brings us too close to current controversies to be discussed here. 67. The political and social reconstruction of the world. The scheme and scale upon which this history is planned do not permit us to enter into the complicated and acrimonious disputes that center about the treaties, and particularly of the Treaty of Versailles, which concluded the Great War. We are beginning to realize that that conflict, terrible and enormous as it was, ended nothing, began nothing and settled nothing. It killed millions of people, it wasted and impoverished the world. It smashed Russia altogether. It was at best an acute and frightful reminder that we were living foolishly and confusedly without much plan or foresight in a dangerous and unsympathetic universe. The crudely organized egotisms and passions of national and imperial greed that carried mankind into that tragedy, emerged from it sufficiently unimpaired to make some other similar disaster highly probable so soon as the world has a little recovered from its war exhaustion and fatigue. Wars and revolutions make nothing. Their utmost service to mankind is that, in a very rough and painful way, they destroy superannuated and obstructive things. The Great War lifted the threat of German imperialism from Europe, and shattered the imperialism of Russia. It cleared away a number of monarchies. But a multitude of flags still waves in Europe, the frontiers still exasperate, great armies accumulate fresh stores of equipment. The peace conference at Versailles was a gathering very ill adapted to do more than carry out the conflicts and defeats of the war to their logical conclusions. The Germans, Austrians, Turks and Bulgarians were permitted no share in its deliberations, they were only to accept the decisions it dictated to them. From the point of view of human welfare, the choice of the place of meeting was particularly unfortunate. It was at Versailles in 1871 that, with every circumstance of triumphant vulgarity, the new German Empire had been proclaimed. The suggestion of a melodramatic reversal of that scene, in the same hall of mirrors, was overpowering. Whatever generosities had appeared in the opening phases of the Great War had long been exhausted. The populations of the victorious countries were acutely aware of their own losses and sufferings, and entirely regardless of the fact that the defeated had paid in the like manner. The war had arisen as a natural and inevitable consequence of the competitive nationalisms of Europe and the absence of any federal adjustment of these competitive forces. War is the necessary logical consummation of independent sovereign nationalities living in too small an area with too powerful an armament, And if the Great War had not come in the form it did, it would have come in some similar form, just as it will certainly return upon a still more disastrous scale in 20 or 30 years. Time if no political unification anticipates and prevents it. States organized for war will make wars as surely as hens will lay eggs, but the feeling of these distressed and war-worn countries disregarded this fact, and the whole of the defeated peoples were treated as morally and materially responsible for all the damage, as they would no doubt have treated the victor peoples had the issue of war been different. The French and English thought the Germans were to blame, the Germans thought the Russians, French and English were to blame, and only an intelligent minority thought that there was anything to blame in the fragmentary political constitution of Europe. The Treaty of Versailles was intended to be exemplary and vindictive. It provided tremendous penalties for the vanquished. It sought to provide compensations for the wounded and suffering victors by imposing enormous debts upon nations already bankrupt, and its attempts to reconstitute international relations by the establishment of a League of Nations against war were manifestly insincere and inadequate. So far as Europe was concerned, it is doubtful if there would have been any attempt whatever to organize international relations for a permanent peace. The proposal of the League of Nations was brought into practical politics by the President of the United States of America, President Wilson. Its chief support was in America. So far the United States, this new modern state, had developed no distinctive ideas of international relationship beyond the Monroe Doctrine, which protected the New World from European interference. Now suddenly it was called upon for its mental contribution to the vast problem of the time. It had none. The natural disposition of the American people was towards a permanent world peace. With this, however, was linked a strong traditional distrust of Old World polities and a habit of isolation from Old World entanglements. The Americans had hardly begun to think out an American solution of world problems when the submarine campaign of the Germans dragged them into the war on the side of the anti-German allies. President Wilson's scheme of a League of Nations was an attempt at short notice to create a distinctively American world project. It was a sketchy, inadequate, and dangerous scheme. In Europe, however, it was taken as a matured American point of view. The generality of mankind in 1918-19 was intensely weary of war and anxious at almost any sacrifice to erect barriers against its recurrence, but there was not a single government in the Old World willing to waive one iota of its sovereign independence to attain any such end. The public utterances of President Wilson leading up to the project of a World League of Nations seemed for a time to appeal right over the heads of the governments to the peoples of the world. They were taken as expressing the ripe intentions of America, and the response was enormous. Unhappily, President Wilson had to deal with governments and not with peoples. He was a man capable of tremendous flashes of vision and yet when put to the test egotistical and limited, and the great wave of enthusiasm he evoked passed and was wasted. Says Dr. Dillon in his book, The Peace Conference, Europe, when the president touched its shores, was as clay ready for the creative potter. Never before were the nations so eager to follow a Moses who would take them to the long-promised land where wars are prohibited and blockades unknown. And to their thinking he was just that great leader. In France men bowed down before him with awe and affection. Labour leaders in Paris told me that they shed tears of joy in his presence, and that their comrades would go through fire and water to help him to realize his noble schemes. To the working classes in Italy his name was a heavenly clarion at the sound of which the earth would be renewed. The Germans regarded him and his doctrine as their sheet anchor of safety. The fearless Herr Mühlen said, if President Wilson were to address the Germans and pronounce a severe sentence upon them, they would accept it with resignation and without a murmur and set to work at once. In German Austria his fame was that of a savior, and the mere mention of his name brought balm to the suffering and surcease of sorrow to the afflicted. Such were the overpowering expectations that President Wilson raised. How completely he disappointed them and how weak and futile was the League of Nations he made is too long and too distressful a story to tell here. He exaggerated in his person our common human tragedy. He was so very great in his dreams and so incapable in his performance. America dissented from the acts of its president and would not join the League. Europe accepted from him. There was a slow realization on the part of the American people that it had been rushed into something for which it was totally unprepared. There was a corresponding realization on the part of Europe that America had nothing ready to give to the Old World in its extremity. Born prematurely and crippled at its birth, that league has become indeed, with its elaborate and unpractical constitution and its manifest limitations of power, a serious obstacle in the way of any effective reorganization of international relationships. The problem would be a clearer one if the League did not yet exist. Yet that worldwide blaze of enthusiasm that first welcomed the project, that readiness of men everywhere round and about the earth, of men, that is, as distinguished from governments, for a world control of war, is a thing to be recorded with emphasis in any history. Behind the short-sighted governments that divide and mismanage human affairs, a real force for world unity and world order exists and grows. From 1918 onward the world entered upon an age of conferences. Of these the conference at Washington called by President Harding, 1921, has been the most successful and suggestive. Notable, too, is the Genoa Conference, 1922, for the appearance of German and Russian delegates at its deliberations. We will not discuss this long procession of conferences and tentatives in any detail. It becomes more and more clearly manifest that a huge work of reconstruction has to be done by mankind if a crescendo of such convulsions and world massacres as that of the Great War is to be averted. No such hasty improvisation as the League of Nations, no patched-up system of conferences between this group of states and that, which change nothing with an air of settling everything, will meet the complex political needs of the new age that lies before us. A systematic development and a systematic application of the sciences of human relationship, of personal and group psychology, of financial and economic science and of education, sciences still only in their infancy, is required. Narrow and obsolete, dead and dying moral and political ideas have to be replaced by a clearer and a simpler conception of the common origins and destinies of our kind. But if the dangers, confusions, and disasters that crowd upon man in these days are enormous beyond any experience of the past, it is because science has brought him such powers as he never had before. And the scientific method of fearless thought, exhaustively lucid statement, and exhaustively criticized planning, which has given him these as yet uncontrollable powers, gives him also the hope of controlling these powers. Man is still only adolescent. His troubles are not the troubles of senility and exhaustion but of increasing and still undisciplined strength. When we look at all history as one process, as we have been doing in this book, when we see the steadfast upward struggle of life towards vision and control, then we see in their true proportions the hopes and dangers of the present time. As yet we are hardly in the earliest dawn of human greatness. But in the beauty of flower and sunset, in the happy and perfect movement of young animals and in the delight of 10,000 various landscapes, we have some intimations of what life can do for us, and in some few works of plastic and pictorial art, in some great music, in a few noble buildings and happy gardens, we have an intimation of what the human will can do with material possibilities. We have dreams, we have at present undisciplined but ever-increasing power. Can we doubt that presently our race will more than realize our boldest imaginations, that it will achieve unity and peace, that it will live, the children of our blood and lives will live, in a world made more splendid and lovely than any palace or garden that we know, going on from strength to strength in an ever-widening circle of adventure and achievement? What man has done, the little triumphs of his present state, and all this history we have told, form but the prelude to the things that man has got to do. Chronological Table. About the year 1000 BC the Aryan peoples were establishing themselves in the peninsulas of Spain, Italy and the Balkans, and they were established in North India. Knossos was already destroyed in the spacious times of Egypt, of Thothmes III, Amenephis III, and Ramses II were 3 or 4 centuries away. Weak monarchs of the Xerxes dynasty were ruling in the Nile Valley. Israel was united under her early kings. Saul or David or possibly even Solomon may have been reigning. Saga 2750 BC, of the Akkadian Sumerian Empire was a remote memory in Babylonian history, more remote than is Constantine the Great from the world of the present day. Hammurabi had been dead 1,000 years. The Assyrians were already dominating the less military Babylonians. In 1100 BC Tiglath-Pileser I had taken Babylon. But there was no permanent conquest. Assyria and Babylonia were still separate empires. In China the new Zhou dynasty was flourishing. Stonehenge in England was already some hundreds of years old. The next 2 centuries saw a renaissance of Egypt under the Xxian dynasty, the splitting up of the brief Little Hebrew Kingdom of Solomon, the spreading of the Greeks in the Balkans, South Italy and Asia Minor, and the days of Etruscan predominance in central Italy. We begin our list of ascertainable dates with BC 800, the building of Carthage. 790, the Ethiopian conquest of Egypt, founding the XXVTH dynasty. 776, First Olympiad. 753, Rome built. 745, Tiglath-Pileser III conquered Babylonia and founded the new Assyrian Empire. 722, Sargon II armed the Assyrians with iron weapons. 721, he deported the Israelites. 680, Esarhaddon took Thebes in Egypt, overthrowing the Ethiopian XXVTH dynasty. 664, Psammetichus I restored the freedom of Egypt and founded the XXVth dynasty, to 610. 608, Necho of Egypt defeated Josiah, king of Judah, at the Battle of Megiddo. 606, capture of Nineveh by the Chaldeans and Medes. Foundation of the Chaldean Empire. 604, Necho pushed to the Euphrates and was overthrown by Nebuchadnezzar II. Nebuchadnezzar carried off the Jews to Babylon. 550, Cyrus the Persian succeeded Cyaxares the Mede. Cyrus conquered Croesus. Buddha lived about this time. So also did Confucius and Lao Tse. 539, Cyrus took Babylon and founded the Persian Empire. 521, Darius I, the son of Hystaspes, ruled from the Hellespont to the Indus. His expedition to Scythia. 490, Battle of Marathon. 480, Battles of Thermopylae and Salamis. 479, the battles of Plataea and Mycale completed the repulse of Persia. 474, Etruscan fleet destroyed by the Sicilian Greeks. 431, Peloponnesian War began, to 404. 401, Retreat of the 10,000. 359, Philip became king of Macedonia. 338, Battle of Chaeronea. 336, Macedonian troops crossed into Asia. Philip murdered. 334, Battle of the Granicus. 333. Battle of Issus. 331, Battle of Arbela. 330, Darius III killed. 323, Death of Alexander the Great. 321, Rise of Chandragupta in the Punjab. The Romans completely beaten by the Samnites at the Battle of the Caudine Forks. 281, Pyrrhus invaded Italy. 280, Battle of Heraclea. 279, Battle of Osculum. 278, Gauls raided into Asia Minor and settled in Galatia. 275, Pyrrhus left Italy. 264, First Punic War. Asoka began to reign in Bayho to 227. 260, Battle of Mylae. 256, Battle of Ecnomus. 246, Shahwanti became king of Tiasin. 220, Shahwanti became emperor of China. 214, Great Wall of China begun. 210, Death of Shahwanti. 202, Battle of Zama. 146, Carthage destroyed. 133, Attalus bequeathed Pergamum to Rome. 102. Marius drove back Germans. 100. Triumph of Marius. Chinese conquering the Tarim Valley. 89. All Italians became Roman citizens. 73. The revolt of the slaves under Spartacus. 71. Defeat and end of Spartacus. 66. Pompey led Roman troops to the Caspian and Euphrates. He encountered the Alani. 48. Julius Caesar defeated Pompey at Pharsalos. 44. Julius Caesar assassinated. 27. Augustus Caesar princeps, until 14 AD. 4. True date of birth of Jesus of Nazareth. AD Christian era began. 14. Augustus died. Tiberius emperor. 30. Jesus of Nazareth crucified. 41. Claudius, the first emperor of the legions, made emperor by Praetorian Guard after murder of Caligula. 68. Suicide of Nero. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, emperors in succession. 69. Vespasian. 102. Panchao on the Caspian Sea. 117. Hadrian succeeded Trajan. Roman Empire at its greatest extent. 138. The Indo-Scythians at this time were destroying the last traces of Hellenic rule in India. 161. Marcus Aurelius succeeded Antoninus Pius. 164. Great Plague began, and lasted to the death of M. Aurelius, 180. This also devastated all Asia. Nearly a century of war and disorder began in the Roman Empire. 220. End of the Han Dynasty. Beginning of 400 years of division in China. 227. Ardashir I, first Sassanid Shah, put an end to Arsacid line in Persia. 242. Mani began his teaching. 247. Goths crossed Danube in a great raid. 251. Great victory of Goths. Emperor Decius killed. 260. Sapor I, the second Sassanid Shah, took Ansh, captured the Emperor Valerian, and was cut up on his return from Asia Minor by Odenathus of Palmyra. 277. Mani crucified in Persia. 284. Diocletian became emperor. 303. Diocletian persecuted the Christians. 311. Galerius abandoned the persecution of the Christians. 312. Constantine the Great became emperor. 323. Constantine presided over the Council of Nicaea. 337. Constantine baptized on his deathbed. 361-3. Julian the Apostate attempted to substitute Mithraism for Christianity. 392. Theodosius the Great Emperor of East and West. 395. Theodosius the Great died. Honorius and Arcadius redivided the empire with Stilicho and Alaric as their masters and protectors. 410. The Visigoths under Alaric captured Rome. 425. Vandals settling in south of Spain. Huns in Pannonia, Goths in Dalmatia. Visigoths and Suevi in Portugal and North Spain. English invading Britain. 439. Vandals took Carthage. 451. Attila raided Gaul and was defeated by Franks, Alemanni and Romans at Troyes. 453. Death of Attila. 455. Vandals sacked Rome. 470. Odoacer, king of a medley of Teutonic tribes, informed Constantinople that there was no emperor in the West. End of the Western Empire. 493. Theodoric, the Ostrogoth, conquered Italy and became king of Italy, but was nominally subject to Constantinople. Gothic kings in Italy. Goths settled on special confiscated lands as a garrison. 527. Justinian Emperor. 529, Justinian closed the schools at Athens, which had flourished nearly 1,000 years. Belisarius, Justinian's general, took Naples. 531, Chosroes I began to reign. 543, Great Plague in Constantinople. 553, Goths expelled from Italy by Justinian. Justinian died. The Lombards conquered most of North Italy, leaving Ravenna and Rome Byzantine. 570, Muhammad born. 579, Chosroes I died. The Lombards dominant in Italy. 590, plague raged in Rome. Chosroes II began to reign. 610, Heraclius began to reign. 619, Chosroes II held Egypt, Jerusalem, Damascus, and armies on Hellespont. Tang dynasty began in China. 622, the Hegira. 627, Great Persian defeat at Nineveh by Heraclius. Taizong became Emperor of China. 628, Kavad II murdered and succeeded his father, Chosroes II. Muhammad wrote letters to all the rulers of the earth. 629, Muhammad returned to Mecca. 632, Muhammad died. Abu Bakr Caliph. 634, Battle of the Yarmouk. Muslims took Syria. Omar II Caliph. 635, Taizong received Nestorian missionaries. 637, Battle of Qadisiyah. 638, Jerusalem surrendered to the Caliph Omar. 642, Heraclius died. 643, Othman III Caliph. 655, defeat of the Byzantine fleet by the Muslims. 668, the Caliph Muawiyah attacked Constantinople by sea. 687, Pepin of Herstal, mayor of the palace, reunited Austrasia and Neustria. 711, Muslim army invaded Spain from Africa. 715, the domains of the Caliph Walid I extended from the Pyrenees to China. 717–18, Suleiman, son and successor of Walid, failed to take Constantinople. 732, Charles Martel defeated the Muslims near Poitiers. 751, Pepin crowned king of the French. 768, Pepin died. 771, Charlemagne sole king. 774, Charlemagne conquered Lombardy. 786, Harun al-Rashid Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, to 809. 795, Leo III became Pope, to 816. 800, Leo crowned Charlemagne Emperor of the West. 802, Egbert, formerly an English refugee at the court of Charlemagne, established himself as King of Wessex. 810, Crom of Bulgaria defeated and killed the Emperor Nicephorus. 814, Charlemagne died. 828, Egbert became first King of England. 843, Louis the Pious died, and the Carlovingian Empire went to pieces. Until 962 there was no regular succession of Holy Roman Emperors, though the title appeared intermittently. 850, about this time Rurik, a Northman, became ruler of Novgorod and Kiev. 852, Boris first Christian king of Bulgaria, to 884. 865, the fleet of the Russians, Northmen, threatened Constantinople. 904, Russian, Northmen, fleet off Constantinople. 912, Rolf the Ganger established himself in Normandy. 919, Henry the Fowler elected King of Germany. 936, Otto I became King of Germany in succession to his father, Henry the Fowler. 941, Russian fleet again threatened Constantinople. 962, Otto I, King of Germany, crowned emperor, first Saxon emperor, by John XII. 987, Hugh Capet became King of France. End of the Carlovingian line of French kings. 1016, Canute became King of England, Denmark and Norway. 1043, Russian fleet threatened Constantinople. 1066, Conquest of England by William, Duke of Normandy. 1071, Revival of Islam under the Seljuk Turks. Battle of Melisgerd. 1073, Hildebrand became Pope, Gregory VII, to 1085. 1084, Robert Guiscard, the Norman, sacked Rome. 1087–99. Urban II Pope. 1095, Urban II at Clermont summoned the First Crusade. 1096, Massacre of the People's Crusade. 1099, Godfrey of Bouillon captured Jerusalem. 1147, the Second Crusade. 1169, Saladin Sultan of Egypt. 1176, Frederick Barbarossa acknowledged supremacy of the Pope, Alexander III, at Venice. 1187, Saladin captured Jerusalem. 1189, the Third Crusade. 1198, Innocent III Pope, to 1216. Frederick II, aged 4, King of Sicily, became his ward. 1202, the Fourth Crusade attacked the Eastern Empire. 1204, capture of Constantinople by the Latins. 1214, Genghis Khan took Pekin. 1226, Saint Francis of Assisi died. The Franciscans. 1227, Genghis Khan died. Khan from the Caspian to the Pacific, and was succeeded by Ogdai Khan. 1228, Frederick II embarked upon the Sixth Crusade, and acquired Jerusalem. 1240, Mongols destroyed Kiev. Russia tributary to the Mongols. 1241, Mongol victory in Liegnitz in Silesia. 1250, Frederick II, the last Hohenstaufen emperor, died. German interregnum until 1273. 1251, Mangu Khan became Great Khan. Kublai Khan governor of China. 1258, Hulagu Khan took and destroyed Baghdad. 1260, Kublai Khan became Great Khan. 1261, the Greeks recaptured Constantinople from the Latins. 1273, Rudolf of Habsburg elected emperor. The Swiss formed their everlasting league. 1280, Kublai Khan founded the Yuan dynasty in China. 1292, death of Kublai Khan. 1293, Roger Bacon, the prophet of experimental science, died. 1348, the Great Plague, the Black Death. 1360, in China the Mongol, Yuan, dynasty fell, and was succeeded by the Ming dynasty, to 1644. 1377, Pope Gregory XI returned to Rome. 1378, the Great Schism. Urban VI in Rome, Clement VII at Avignon. 1398, Huss preached Wycliffism at Prague. 1414–18. The Council of Constance. Huss burnt, 1415. 1417, the Great Schism ended. 1453, Ottoman Turks under Muhammad II took Constantinople. 1480, Ivan III, Grand Duke of Moscow, threw off the Mongol allegiance. 1481, death of the Sultan Muhammad II while preparing for the conquest of Italy. 1486, Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope. 1492, Columbus crossed the Atlantic to America. 1498, Maximilian I became emperor. 1498, Vasco da Gama sailed round the Cape to India. 1499, Switzerland became an independent republic. 1500, Charles V born. 1509, Henry VIII King of England. 1513, Leo X Pope. 1515, Francis I King of France. 1520, Suleiman the Magnificent, Sultan, to 1566, who ruled from Baghdad to Hungary. Charles V Emperor. 1525, Babur won the Battle of Panipat, captured Delhi, and founded the Mughal Empire. 1527, the German troops in Italy, under the Constable of Bourbon, took and pillaged Rome. 1529, Suleiman besieged Vienna. 1530, Charles V crowned by the Pope. Henry VIII began his quarrel with the papacy. 1539, the Society of Jesus founded. 1546, Martin Luther died. 1547, Ivan IV, the Terrible, took the title of Tsar of Russia. 1556, Charles V abdicated. Akbar, Great Mughal, to 1605. Ignatius of Loyola died. 1558, death of Charles V. 1566, Suleiman the Magnificent died. 1603, James I King of England and Scotland. 1620, Mayflower expedition founded New Plymouth. First Negro slaves landed at Jamestown, VA. 1625, Charles I of England. 1626, Sir Francis Bacon, Lord Verulam, died. 1643, Louis XIV began his reign of 72 years. 1644, the Manchus ended the Ming dynasty. 1648, Treaty of Westphalia. Thereby Holland and Switzerland were recognized as free republics and Prussia became important. The treaty gave a complete victory neither to the imperial crown nor to the princes. War of the Fronde, it ended in the complete victory of the French crown. 1649, execution of Charles I of England. 1658, Aurangzeb Great Mughal. Cromwell died. 1660, Charles II of England. 1674, New Amsterdam finally became British by treaty and was renamed New York. 1683, the last Turkish attack on Vienna defeated by John III of Poland. 1689, Peter the Great of Russia. To 1725. 1701, Frederick I King of Prussia. 1707, death of Aurangzeb. The empire of the Great Mughal disintegrated. 1713, Frederick the Great of Prussia born. 1715, Louis XV of France. 1755–63, Britain and France struggled for America and India. France in alliance with Austria and Russia against Prussia and Britain, 1756–63, the 7 Years' War. 1759, the British general, Wolfe, took Quebec. 1760, George III of Britain. 1763, Peace of Paris, Canada ceded to Britain. British dominant in India. 1769, Napoleon Bonaparte born. 1774, Louis XVI began his reign. 1776, Declaration of Independence by the United States of America. 1783, Treaty of Peace between Britain and the new United States of America. 1787, the Constitutional Convention of Philadelphia set up the federal government of the United States. France discovered to be bankrupt. 1788, First Federal Congress of the United States at New York. 1789, the French States General assembled. Storming of the Bastille. 1791, Flight to Varennes. 1792, France declared war on Austria. Prussia declared war on France. Battle of Valmy. France became a republic. 1793, Louis XVI beheaded. 1794, execution of Robespierre and end of the Jacobin Republic. 1795, the Directory. Bonaparte suppressed a revolt and went to Italy as commander-in-chief. 1798, Bonaparte went to Egypt. Battle of the Nile. 1799, Bonaparte returned to France. He became first consul with enormous powers. 1804, Bonaparte became emperor. Francis II took the title of Emperor of Austria in 1805, and in 1806 he dropped the title of Holy Roman Emperor. So the Holy Roman Empire came to an end. 1806, Prussia overthrown at Jena. 1808, Napoleon made his brother Joseph King of Spain. 1810, Spanish America became republican. 1812, Napoleon's retreat from Moscow. 1814, abdication of Napoleon. Louis XVIII. 1824, Charles X of France. 1825, Nicholas I of Russia. First railway, Stockton to Darlington. 1827, Battle of Navarino. 1829, Greece independent. 1830, a year of disturbance. Louis-Philippe ousted Charles X, Belgium broke away from Holland. Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha became king of this new country, Belgium. Russian Poland revolted ineffectually. 1835, the word socialism first used. 1837, Queen Victoria. 1840, Queen Victoria married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. 1852, Napoleon III Emperor of the French. 1854–56, Crimean War. 1856, Alexander II of Russia. 1861, Victor Emmanuel I King of Italy. Abraham Lincoln became President, USA. The American Civil War began. 1865, surrender of Appomattox Courthouse. Japan opened to the world. 1870, Napoleon III declared war against Prussia. 1871, Paris surrendered, January. The King of Prussia became German Emperor. The Peace of Frankfurt. 1878, the Treaty of Berlin. The armed peace of 4 to 6 years began in Western Europe. 1888, Frederick II, March, William II, June, German emperors. 1912, China became a republic. 1914, the Great War in Europe began. 1917, the two Russian revolutions. Establishment of the Bolshevik regime in Russia. 1918, the armistice. 1920, first meeting of the League of Nations, from which Germany, Austria, Russia, and Turkey were excluded and at which the United States was not represented. 1921, the Greeks, in complete disregard of the League of Nations, make war upon the Turks. 1922, great defeat of the Greeks in Asia Minor by the Turks. The end.